My daughter-in-law said my hands carried bad luck. She pushed me away from my grandson's cradle as if I were a shadow to be feared. I stayed silent, because I knew an old man's word is rarely valued. But when the baby needed something that couldn't be bought for any amount of money, it turned out that what could save his life was inside me. And then the doctor spoke aloud, the one sentence that shattered their certainty and my silence in an instant. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Raymond Ellis. I was 73 years old and had been retired for 8 years. Before that, I spent most of my life as a residential electrician in Columbus, Ohio. I worked with my hands, climbed ladders until my knees started to scream, and knew every type of wiring that ran through American homes from the 1960s to the early 2000s. I didn't make much noise in the world, but I built it, room by room, outlet by outlet. I provided what others needed, but rarely noticed: light, warmth, power. And when I came home, there was always someone waiting. My wife, Marlene. She used to say that every man needs a room to put his hands down. For me, that was our house on Ashview Lane. We bought that home in 1976. It had terrible insulation, windows that moaned in the wind, and the kind of basement where rust never slept. But it was ours. We patched the roof together, painted the porch in August humidity, and built our life inside it with ordinary things. After she died, the walls echoed differently. Her voice had a rhythm, a softness that touched the edges of the furniture. After she was gone, even the chairs seemed brittle. I stopped using her side of the bed. I couldn't bring myself to move her hairbrush, still holding a few strands. I left it all, as though she might return to it. Grief is not dramatic. It's quiet, like a fan that never turns off. That spring, the news came. My daughter-in-law, Caitlin, gave birth to a baby boy. My son, Aaron, called to let me know. He said the delivery went fine, that the baby had strong lungs, and that Caitlin was recovering. His voice was a little distant, rushed. He didn't say much more than he had to. I congratulated him and asked when I could visit. He said they'd let me know. He said Caitlin's mother was already there, and the house was a bit crowded. I hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen, holding the receiver for longer than I should have. The cord twisted around my hand like a question. I didn't ask to move in. I didn't ask for anything at all. I just wanted to see my grandson, maybe hold him for a moment, smell that new baby scent that lives somewhere between milk and sleep. I wanted to feel like something of me had gone forward, past the end of Marlene, past the silence of the empty hallway. I went into the guest room, the room we had once hoped would be a nursery if we ever had a second child. That never happened. We lost the baby early, and after that, Marlene didn't try again. I opened the closet and pulled out the small wooden cradle I'd built years ago. I had kept it covered with a quilt she made, one with little bears and moons stitched in navy and cream. The wood was still solid. The legs were steady. I had made it from pine boards I found at a local yard sale, planed and sanded them smooth until they felt like silk under my fingers. The cradle was meant to rock gently, side to side, almost like breathing. I took it out, set it in the living room, and sat down across from it. The room had no child in it, no laughter, no noise, just a cradle waiting for a name, waiting for a weight to make it useful again. I imagined what it might be like, to have the baby visit, to see his fingers curl around the edge of a blanket. I imagined taking a picture, maybe just one, of him lying there, safe in something my hands had shaped. I called Aaron again a few days later. He picked up after the third ring. I told him I had something I wanted to give them, something I made with care. He was polite, but I could hear hesitation. He said Caitlin had certain preferences about baby items, about what she considered safe and clean. I said I understood. I didn't press. I just said it was here. If they changed their minds. They didn't. Weeks passed. I drove by their house twice, both times slowly, never stopping. I saw the SUV in the driveway, a stroller folded near the porch. The blinds were drawn in the front room. I didn't want to intrude. I didn't want to be a burden. But the ache inside me grew deeper, not louder, just heavier. In the quiet of my own home, I sat with my memories. I thought of Aaron as a baby, how he once fit in the crook of my arm, how he cried like a siren when I tried to clip his nails. I remembered holding his bottle at midnight, one foot gently tapping the rocking chair into motion. That cradle had waited for another child, and now it waited again. Not for a stranger, but for my blood. The house felt wrong without him. A man's house shrinks when the future doesn't visit. My tools were organized, my yard mowed, my medications in their daily box. But none of it gave the shape of purpose. My phone didn't ring unless it was a spam call or a reminder from the pharmacy. The TV flickered soundlessly in the evenings, casting cold light on an armchair too large for one person. I tried not to think of Caitlin too much. We had never been close, but I never expected contempt. Maybe she thought I was unclean, a relic from a time she didn't admire. She came from a family that spoke of energy crystals and aura cleansing. Once at Thanksgiving, she told me I carried a dense vibration. I didn't know what that meant. I just passed the mashed potatoes and kept my thoughts to myself. Still, it stung. The cradle remained where I'd left it, in the corner of the room. I dusted it weekly, even though no one used it. Sometimes I ran my fingers along the edge of the wood, checking for splinters. There were none. It was still solid. Still waiting. One night I dreamed the baby was here. He was sleeping in the cradle, one hand curled by his cheek, one foot twitching in the way babies do when they dream. The room was filled with warmth. I sat beside him and just listened to the soft sound of his breath. When I woke up, the silence was worse than usual. The dream had given me something real, something tangible, and waking had taken it away. That day, I put the cradle back into the closet. I covered it with the quilt again and closed the door softly. I told myself I didn't need to bring it out anymore. Maybe he would never see it. Maybe it would remain just a piece of wood, shaped by longing. But I didn't throw it away. I couldn't. The hospital had that smell I remembered from years ago. A sharp, sterile scent that wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about control, about stripping the world down to what could be measured, treated, charted. I hadn't been in a hospital since Marlene's last days, and even then, I only went as far as her room. This time, the lobby alone brought something heavy down onto my shoulders. The air was cold, humming with ventilation. Everything was white or gray or metal. Nothing had softness. Nothing had memory. I walked slowly toward the elevators, clutching a small blue gift bag in one hand. Inside was a stuffed elephant I'd bought from a small store that still used paper receipts. I remembered holding it in the aisle for a long time, wondering if it was too old-fashioned, too simple. Everything for babies now seemed to be minimalist and Scandinavian, but this elephant had ears that flopped and eyes that looked like they might understand things. It reminded me of something I once gave my son, years ago, when he was too small to pronounce the word elephant. The elevator doors opened with a mechanical sigh, and I stepped in, pressing the button for the maternity floor. My reflection in the steel panel surprised me. I looked tired, older than the man I imagined I was. My coat hung a little too loose, my shoulders a little too hunched. The gift bag twisted slightly in my grip, the ribbon fluttering with the movement of the elevator. When the doors opened again, I stepped into a hallway of quiet tension. There was no music, no chatter, just the beep of machines and the distant murmur of voices through closed doors. Nurses moved with efficiency, nodding as they passed. I didn't know where to go at first. There was no sign that said, "New fathers this way," or "Grandfathers welcome." I approached the desk where a young woman in scrubs sat typing. I cleared my throat softly, not wanting to disrupt whatever routine held this place together. After a brief exchange and checking the name, she pointed me toward room 218. I walked slowly, noticing the way each room seemed to carry a different story. Some had balloons tied to door handles. Some had silence so deep you could feel it pressing out into the hall. When I reached the door, I paused. I adjusted my coat, smoothed back my hair, and tried to steady the nervous rhythm of my breathing. Inside, the lights were dimmed. Caitlin lay in the bed, her face pale but serene, turned away from the door. Aaron sat in a chair by the window, cradling the baby in his arms. The moment I stepped in, the sterile smell hit me harder. Disinfectant, plastic, latex gloves, something chemical and unmistakable. The air didn't carry the warmth of birth, only the protocol of medicine. Aaron looked up and nodded. Caitlin didn't move. I hovered by the door, unsure of how much space I was allowed to take up. I offered the gift bag with a quiet gesture. Aaron took it, gave a small, polite smile, and set it down without opening it. The baby squirmed gently in his arms, a tiny face peeking through a swaddle of soft blankets. I wanted to say something about how small he was, how perfect, but I couldn't find the words. My throat felt tight, as if the scent of antiseptic had closed it up. Instead, I stood there, my hands by my sides, feeling the pull of both pride and distance. Caitlin stirred and looked toward me. Her eyes didn't soften. They registered me like a variable, a visitor, not a presence she was glad to see. I tried to smile, but it didn't change the way the air sat between us. The sterile smell seemed to grow thicker. I looked at the baby again, tried to memorize his features, the curve of his nose, the softness of his brow, the slight tremble in his lips as he slept. Aaron asked if I wanted to sit. I declined with a quiet shake of my head. I didn't want to disturb anything. I didn't want to make myself too visible. I knew how fragile those first days could be, how easily tension could creep in and sour a room. I didn't want to bring any of that. I just wanted to see him. That was all. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized that my being there was an intrusion, no matter how carefully I moved or how quietly I breathed. Caitlin turned her face back toward the window. Aaron rocked the baby gently. The silence filled with the hum of machines and the faint rustle of hospital linens. After a few minutes, I said I'd go. No one tried to stop me. I stepped back into the hallway, where the sterile air felt even colder than before. I walked past the desk without a glance, down the hallway, into the elevator. The doors closed with the same mechanical sigh. I caught my reflection again in the steel panel. This time, I looked like someone fading out of his own story. Back in the parking lot, I sat in my truck for a long while. I didn't start the engine. I just watched the clouds roll over the hospital roof, the sky a flat sheet of gray. I thought of the cradle again, sitting empty at home, waiting for a name that might never fill it. I thought of the elephant still wrapped in the gift bag, unopened, anonymous. I didn't cry, but something inside me did fold in on itself, quietly, like paper pressed into a drawer and forgotten. When I finally turned the key in the ignition, I didn't drive home right away. I drove past the park where Aaron used to play. The swings still creaked in the wind. The same bench where I used to sit was still there, though the paint had peeled. I parked for a moment, not because I needed to remember, but because I didn't want the sterile smell to be the last thing I carried with me. Eventually, I drove home. The house greeted me with its usual silence. I set the keys on the counter, took off my coat, and stood in the living room for a while. The cradle was still hidden in the closet. The elephant had come back with me. I didn't take it out of the bag. I just placed it on the chair beside the front window and sat down, listening to the quiet, trying to replace the sterile air with something more human, something like memory, something like breath. I didn't expect a celebration. I didn't expect balloons or cake or words of gratitude, but I did expect to be allowed to hold him. When Aaron finally called and said I could stop by for a short visit, I cleared my afternoon and prepared like I was going on an important appointment. I picked out a clean shirt, the one Marlene had bought me for our last anniversary. It had a small coffee stain near the cuff, but I managed to hide it with a cardigan. I combed my hair, shaved carefully, polished my shoes until they caught the hallway light. I stared at myself in the mirror longer than I had in years. The man looking back at me seemed decent, presentable, not a threat. I wrapped the stuffed elephant again. It had sat on the chair for over a week, untouched. I tied the ribbon tighter and wrote the baby's name on a small tag. For Owen. Just those 2 words. No signature. I didn't want to make the gesture about myself. I only wanted to feel useful, maybe even cherished, if that word still applied to men like me. The drive to their home took less than 20 minutes, but every turn felt longer. I passed the gas station where Aaron once asked me how cars worked, the elementary school where he played his first violin recital, the corner diner where I used to buy him milkshakes on Saturdays. The streets held memories in every crack, every mailbox, every familiar awning. And yet none of those memories gave me the right to knock on their door without permission. When I arrived, I parked across the street. I sat in the car for a few minutes, watching the house. The blinds were half open. A toy hung from the front window, one of those spinning plastic suns with colored blades that turned in the wind. The grass was neatly trimmed. The porch had new railings. Everything looked settled. It was the kind of house where time had its own rules, where minutes didn't belong to outsiders. I approached slowly, gift in hand, feeling the cold air wrap around my ankles. The door opened before I could knock. Aaron smiled faintly, stepped aside, and let me in. He didn't say much, just a low, "Hey, Dad," as he closed the door behind me. The hallway smelled of lavender and baby powder, and somewhere under that, the faint trace of lemon-scented disinfectant. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet where you knew a baby had just fallen asleep or had been coaxed into stillness after hours of fussing. Caitlin stood near the couch, holding Owen in her arms. She didn't look up right away. When she did, her expression didn't shift. No warmth, no smile, just recognition, like acknowledging a delivery man with a package she didn't order. I stepped forward, slowly, cautiously. My hands itched to reach for him, to feel the weight of him. Not because I thought it would fix anything, but because I needed to know what it felt like to hold the future. My future. He was wrapped in a pale green blanket, his tiny face just visible, eyes closed in sleep, or maybe light dozing. I could hear his breath, soft and shallow. It took everything in me not to speak. I only held out my arms, gently, offering nothing more than an embrace. Just the crook of my elbow, steady and sure, a place I'd held my son before him, and my son's tiny toys, and later my wife's cooling hand when her fever climbed too high. But Caitlin turned, ever so slightly, angling her body away from me. It wasn't abrupt. It wasn't dramatic. It was mechanical, practiced, precise. A movement that communicated more than words could have. My arms froze mid-air. I held them there for a second too long, as if waiting for permission that would not come. Then I lowered them, slowly, and folded my hands in front of me, as though they were guilty of something. She shifted Owen to her other arm and adjusted the blanket around his face. Aaron watched quietly, then looked down. No one said anything. The silence didn't break. It settled. I sat on the edge of a nearby chair, unsure of where to place my feet, my eyes, my hands. The elephant sat in the bag at my feet like a small apology. Caitlin remained standing, bouncing Owen slightly, her gaze never quite meeting mine. I didn't know if she believed in curses or old superstitions, or if she just didn't like me. Maybe she thought age brought disease, or that men of my generation were tainted by roughness, by grief, by silence. Maybe she truly believed I would bring bad luck by holding him. Maybe in her world, I was a carrier of sadness, something that shouldn't touch what was new and untouched. I stared at my hands. I remembered every job I'd ever worked, every crawl space I'd wriggled through, every ceiling fan I'd installed, every outlet that shocked me into vigilance. My hands had built homes, repaired heaters in winter storms, lifted boxes heavier than I was supposed to. They had rocked Aaron when he was colicky, held Marlene's shoulders through contractions, tightened bolts on hospital beds for neighbors too proud to ask for help. But those same hands were not welcome here. Not in this house. Not with this child. Caitlin excused herself to another room without a word. Owen's tiny breath disappeared down the hallway. Aaron looked after her, then at me, then back at the floor. I didn't ask questions. I didn't ask why. I already knew the answer. It had been written in the angle of her shoulders, in the grip of her fingers, in the way she had shielded her child, not from harm, but from me. I stayed 10 more minutes. I complimented the curtains. I said the kitchen looked nice. I nodded at nothing in particular, smiled at a wall that had photos I wasn't in, and eventually stood up. Aaron followed me to the door. He didn't open it right away. For a moment, we both just stood there, side by side, like men standing at opposite ends of the same history. When he opened it, the air outside was sharp again. The wind had picked up. I stepped out, bag in hand, the elephant still wrapped, still unopened. I didn't offer it again. I left it on their porch table. Maybe they'd find it. Maybe they'd throw it away. Maybe it would end up in the attic with other things too awkward to explain. I walked back to my truck, started the engine, and let it idle before shifting into drive. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't need to. The moment had already hardened into something permanent. Back home, I poured myself a cup of tea I didn't want. The cup sat on the table, steaming quietly. I stared at my hands again, now resting on the wood grain, veins like roads across dry land. They had done so much, but they would not hold him. And somehow, that truth ached more than any labor I had ever done. I began to wonder if the act of smiling had become a foreign language I had no business speaking anymore. Every time I tried, it felt like it didn't belong to my face, like I was borrowing someone else's expression. And yet, I smiled anyway. That morning, I sat at my small kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the surface like honey that had nowhere else to go. The chair across from me was empty, like it always was. I had stopped setting 2 mugs out. I had stopped slicing fruit for a second plate. But sometimes I still placed the sugar bowl in the middle, even though I no longer took sugar. It wasn't about habit. It was about memory. I hadn't been invited back since my last visit. No calls, no updates. I had become a peripheral figure, someone acknowledged out of duty, not desire. I called once to ask how Owen was doing. Aaron's voice was cordial, clipped. "He's fine," he said. "Caitlin's been tired, but managing." He didn't ask me to come over. He didn't offer a date for a visit. I didn't push. I thanked him, told him to give the baby my love, and hung up. That phrase, "give him my love," tasted artificial as soon as I said it, like biting into wax fruit. A few days later, I found myself in front of the mirror again, not to shave or tidy up, but just to see if anything had changed. My hair was thinner, my eyebrows more wiry. The corners of my mouth naturally pulled downward now, as if sadness had taught my muscles new positions. Still, I forced a smile. It didn't look convincing, but I kept it there. Later that afternoon, I drove to the hardware store. Not because I needed anything in particular, but because walking the aisles felt familiar. The smell of lumber, of motor oil and dust, still grounded me. I wandered past the rows of screws, nails, sealants, holding nothing, buying nothing. I passed a man around my age looking at sprinkler timers. We nodded at each other the way older men do, without words, without reason, just acknowledgement, a form of presence. On the drive home, I passed Aaron's neighborhood. I told myself I was taking a shortcut, but I knew it wasn't true. My hands guided the wheel like they remembered a route I hadn't consciously chosen. The streets were quiet. Spring had finally softened the lawns. Children's chalk drawings sprawled across the sidewalks in crooked suns and impossible rainbows. I slowed the truck near their house. Not enough to be suspicious, but enough to look. That was when I saw him. Owen was outside, nestled in one of those modern strollers that looked more like space equipment than something meant to carry a baby. Caitlin sat on the porch, her phone in one hand, a bottle of water in the other. She wasn't looking at him. She was scrolling, absorbed in something beyond the real. But he was awake, eyes wide and scanning. I parked further down the street and walked back on foot, slow and casual. I told myself I wouldn't approach. I just wanted to see him up close, just one glimpse. As I passed the house, I turned slightly, just enough to catch a fuller view of him. His blanket had slipped down slightly, revealing a bit of his neck, the curve of his chin, the tuft of hair that sat like down on his scalp. I smiled. Not forced this time. Not fake. It rose from something older than pain. I smiled because he existed. Then it happened. He looked at me. Just for a second. Maybe less. His eyes were large, deep pools of unfocused awareness. He didn't know who I was. He didn't know the tension or the words said behind closed doors. He didn't know I'd been kept away. He only knew in that moment that a face passed by and smiled. And in return, he smiled. It wasn't big. It wasn't toothless and wide like babies are known for. It was soft, subtle, a twitch of the lips, a spark of recognition. Maybe not of me, but of something human, something kind. I felt it land in me like an anchor in calm water. For a moment, I was tethered to something real. I kept walking. I didn't stop. I didn't wave. I didn't want to ruin it by asking for more. I walked to the end of the street, turned at the mailbox, and returned to my truck. From the driver's seat, I looked back once. Caitlin hadn't noticed. The stroller was still there, the baby still looking forward. When I got home, I pulled out an old photo album. Not the kind with printed pages, but the kind where you slide pictures into cellophane sleeves. I found the one of Aaron as a baby, lying on the couch in his pajamas, drooling on a stuffed bear. I pulled it out, held it next to a blank card, and wrote one line. He smiled at me. I placed the photo and the card in an envelope and slid it into the drawer of my desk. I didn't address it. I didn't intend to send it. But I needed to preserve the moment, proof that I had existed in his world, even for a heartbeat. Later that night, I walked into the living room and sat by the window. The elephant still sat in its gift bag, the ribbon now slightly creased from time. I reached in, took it out, and placed it on the shelf above the fireplace. Not as a gift waiting to be accepted, but as a reminder, a witness. That smile hadn't changed my place in their family. It hadn't unlocked any doors or erased the ache, but it had reached me. And I held on to it the way old men hold on to things no one else sees as valuable. A glance, a pause, a silent approval from a soul too new to know the cost of giving it. It was a smile without invitation, but it found its way home. The days passed slowly, not because they were empty, but because they carried weight I couldn't put down. Time no longer marched. It settled. It settled in my joints, in my house, in my thoughts. Everything had a heaviness, like books stacked just slightly off balance, waiting to fall if I made the wrong movement. I still went about my routines, washed the dishes, took out the trash, watered the plants that somehow kept growing without being noticed. But everything I did was followed by silence that didn't echo. It just absorbed. My house had become both a refuge and a witness. I had lived in it long enough that the walls held my shape. I could walk through it in darkness without bumping into a thing. I knew which floorboards would creak and which ones gave a little under pressure. I knew when the heater would kick on and when the fridge would hum. It was an old rhythm, the music of a place once full of life, now reduced to whispers. But lately, even those whispers had begun to sound like judgment. It started with the windows. In the afternoons, when the sun slanted across the living room, I'd find myself staring through the glass, not at anything in particular, just out, toward the trees, the street, the spaces where people passed without looking up. I told myself I was enjoying the light, watching the weather, counting the squirrels. But in truth, I was waiting. I was waiting for a sign that I still belonged to the world outside. Most days, nothing happened. But on Thursdays, the recycling truck came. On Fridays, the neighbor's son mowed the lawn and let the clippings blow across my driveway. On Saturdays, the couple down the street walked their dog, stopping to adjust its tiny jacket if the wind picked up. And every now and then, Caitlin would push the stroller past my house. She never looked in, not once. She walked briskly, earbuds in, eyes forward. The baby was bundled up, always tucked tightly, always facing away. I tried not to watch, but my body betrayed me. My knees pulled me to the chair by the window. My hands folded in the same way each time. My eyes followed them until they turned the corner. And still, I smiled. Not because I felt welcomed, but because I couldn't afford to feel otherwise. I smiled because if I didn't, I feared my face would forget how. I feared I would become one of those old men whose features hardened into disappointment. But inside, something began to curl inward. It started as a doubt and grew into a quiet despair. I began to believe that maybe I had already lived the parts of life that mattered. That I was now a shadow behind a window, a presence without substance. The cradle in the closet remained untouched. I hadn't opened the door in weeks. I passed by it every morning, every evening, pretending not to think of the wood inside, the curves I had carved with care, the gentle sway I had tested with my own hands. It was too much to see it empty. It was too much to feel it still had use, but no purpose. I filled the time with small tasks. I recaulked the bathtub. I sorted the screws in my garage into new containers, labeling them with bold black letters. I rewired a broken lamp that hadn't worked in years. I did things that didn't need doing because no one needed me to do anything else. One evening, I walked past my own reflection and didn't recognize it. The man in the window looked like he was waiting for someone to open the door that would never open. I stood there, caught in the double image, the man inside, the world outside. And I realized that the glass had become more than just a barrier. It had become a definition. I had not been invited to see Owen again. Aaron sent occasional updates by text, a new photo, a small anecdote, but they came without context, without warmth, just flashes of a life I wasn't part of. I thanked him each time, typed out more than I sent, then deleted the extra words. I kept it simple. I kept it polite. The smile Owen had given me during that brief sidewalk encounter lingered like a fragile note in the back of my mind. It wasn't enough to carry me forward, but it was too much to forget. I thought of it often. I thought of how something so small had felt so enormous, and I feared that it would be the last such moment I'd ever get. One night, I sat at the kitchen table with all the lights off. The only illumination came from the street lamp outside, filtering through the blinds in thin stripes. I didn't need light to find my mug, I didn't need light to sit in the same chair. I listened to the sounds of my house, the ticking of the clock, the gentle whir of the fridge. Then I heard a car door close in the distance. I stood up, walked slowly to the front room, and looked through the window. It was them, Aaron and Caitlin. The stroller sat by the sidewalk. They stood next to the car, unloading something from the trunk. Caitlin held Owen. Aaron carried a bag. Their movements were routine, fluid. They didn't speak loudly. They didn't notice me. My house was dark. I was invisible. I stood there, just behind the curtain, watching the outline of my own family as if through a screen I would never pass. I didn't want to interrupt. I didn't want to startle them. But more than anything, I didn't want them to look up and find me watching. So I stepped back, let the curtain fall into place, and sat back down in the dark. There was a time when a grandfather's place was near the child. A time when being older meant being trusted, sought after, held in regard. But somewhere between then and now, that connection had been severed. I wasn't angry. Anger requires a belief in fairness. What I felt was quieter, a kind of erosion, a fading. Outside, the shadows shifted. The porch light turned on. Their silhouettes moved across the lawn. Then the door closed, and I remained. Not behind the glass anymore, but behind the years, behind the silence that filled the spaces between their life and mine. I had always known that homes could talk, even when no one was speaking. Floors creaked with memory. Walls carried the warmth of arguments and apologies alike, and doors held the weight of the hands that had opened and closed them over the years. But in Aaron's house, it wasn't the floors or the walls that spoke. It was the spaces between words. It was the whispers I wasn't meant to hear. The invitation came in the form of a favor. Caitlin was exhausted. Aaron had to work late, and they needed someone to stay in the house for a few hours while Owen slept. They didn't ask me directly. Aaron sent a text with 3 lines, short and practical. "Can you come by? Caitlin needs rest, just for a bit." I answered yes without thinking, like someone offered a glass of water in a drought. I arrived just before sunset. The light was still slanting through the blinds when Caitlin opened the door. Her face was pale and taut, her hair pulled back too tightly. She barely looked at me. Owen had just been put down, she said. He was in his room, asleep. All I had to do was listen for the monitor and call if anything seemed wrong. She handed me her phone with the contact for their pediatrician already open. She said she'd be resting in their bedroom down the hall. Then she vanished like steam. The house was quiet, except for the rhythmic click of the wall clock and the occasional rustle from outside. I stood in the living room for a few moments, unsure where I was allowed to exist. I didn't sit. I didn't turn on the television. I simply placed my coat on the back of a chair and waited. From where I stood, I could see the hallway that led to the bedrooms. The nursery door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness between its edges. The baby monitor sat on the side table, its small green light blinking softly like a heartbeat. I walked over, adjusted the angle slightly, and leaned closer to hear the static and faint breaths coming through. Owen was quiet, peaceful. I moved toward the kitchen, not to eat, but to fill a glass of water. The faucet squeaked when I turned it, and I winced at the sound. I drank slowly, letting the cold spread through me. As I stood there, I heard a voice, soft, tense, not directed toward me. It came from the hallway. I froze, glass still in hand. At first I thought Caitlin might be on the phone, but the tone wasn't the practiced rhythm of conversation. It was more like 2 people speaking in hushed urgency. I stepped back into the living room, careful not to make the floorboards protest. I couldn't make out the full sentences at first, just fragments, words caught in the throat of the house. He's here again. I just needed sleep. Can't keep pretending. Feels wrong. I didn't move. I stood by the entryway, the soft glow of the monitor behind me, and let the words find me. They weren't for me, that much was clear, but they were about me. Of that I was certain. The voices continued, low and muffled. I recognized Aaron's. He must have arrived through the back door, or perhaps he'd never left. I hadn't heard a car. I hadn't heard the lock, just voices. Caitlin sounded tired, but not in the way of a new mother. Her voice had the fatigue of resentment, the exhaustion of carrying something longer than she wanted to. Doesn't know when to stop. He keeps watching, like he's waiting for something. I looked at my hands. They were steady, weathered, not shaking, not threatening. But in that moment, they felt too large, too visible. I imagined how I must appear from their perspective. An old man with kind eyes and a silent posture. A man who never asked for much, but never left either. A shadow, perhaps, or a memory they didn't want to carry. I set the empty glass down on the kitchen counter and walked slowly back toward the living room. I didn't want to hear more. I didn't want to pick apart the syllables and find pieces of myself in them. I returned to the chair by the window and sat down. I didn't look out. I didn't look at the monitor. I just stared at the fabric of the curtains, tracing the soft lines in the weave. I thought about all the times I had told myself to be patient, that love returned eventually, that family meant weathering distance, that silence was sometimes the most respectful thing you could offer. But sitting there, listening to them speak about me in hushed tones, I realized that silence could also be complicity, that my absence in their words wasn't noble. It was convenient. I stayed until the clock ticked past 7. Caitlin emerged first. She didn't look at me. She thanked me, almost like an automated response. Aaron followed, keys in hand, nodding once as if to say we were finished. I put on my coat without a word. I didn't ask about the whispers. I didn't need to. They had already taken root. Outside, the evening air pressed against my lungs. It had the sharpness of something unfinished. I walked slowly to my truck, feeling the eyes of the house behind me. Whether they watched or not, I couldn't say. But I felt seen in a way that made me smaller. At home, I sat on the edge of my bed and untied my shoes like a man who had just returned from someplace much farther than a suburban street. I didn't turn on the light. I let the dark settle around me like dust. In that darkness, I thought of my father, of how I used to think he was distant and cold, but now I wondered how much of his silence had been fear, how much of it had been love misplaced. Maybe he too had listened to whispers in hallways and decided it was better to keep quiet than to make himself louder. I lay back against the pillows and stared at the ceiling. The house didn't whisper. It groaned softly with the wind, with age, with time. My eyes stayed open long into the night, not because I couldn't sleep, but because I wasn't sure if dreams were still something I had access to. And in the space between night and dawn, I finally understood that even when you're invited into the house, you can still be left in the hallway. It was just past midnight when I woke up, though I hadn't truly been asleep. Sleep had become a loose agreement with my body, an understanding that I would lie still in darkness, but my mind wouldn't make promises. That night, I had dozed in my chair again, a habit that had become more ritual than comfort. I never intended to fall asleep in it. I just sat down to think and stayed there too long. The television had gone dark on its own. The cup of tea I had poured sat untouched on the side table, now cold. The only sound in the house was the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I shifted, reached for the remote, and turned off the screen completely. The glow vanished, and the room became a quiet pool of shadows and waiting. That was when I heard the phone ring. It wasn't loud, just a soft buzz against the stillness, but it startled me enough that my heart picked up speed. I reached for it quickly, blinking at the screen. It was Aaron. Calls at midnight rarely bring good news. I answered with a quiet hello and heard his voice, flat, breathless, coated in something that wasn't panic, but close enough to set every nerve in my body on alert. He said Owen had been breathing strangely, that his color didn't look right, that Caitlin was already in the car with him, heading to the emergency room. He asked if I could meet them there. I didn't ask questions. I said yes, and hung up. My hands moved before my thoughts did. I grabbed my coat, my keys, my wallet. I didn't bother to comb my hair or check the mirror. I was already halfway to the truck before I realized I was still wearing slippers. I didn't go back inside. The night air was sharp, windless. My breath fogged the windshield before the defroster kicked in. The truck's engine stuttered for a second before catching. Headlights cut through the dark as I pulled out of the driveway and turned toward the hospital. The roads were empty. Every red light felt like a threat. I kept my hands tight on the wheel, knuckles white, body rigid. My mind kept replaying Aaron's voice, muted, tense, filled with the strain of helplessness. I thought of the times Marlene had gotten up at night when Aaron was sick, how she used to hum to him as she sat beside his crib, even when he was too young to understand the melody. I remembered the way she used to press her hand to his chest, counting the rise and fall of his breath like it was the only truth in the world. By the time I reached the hospital, my back ached from the grip I'd held on the steering wheel. I parked in the first open spot I saw and walked quickly to the emergency entrance. The glass doors parted silently, and the sterile air rushed over me. Bright lights, chemical tang, white walls that seemed to narrow the deeper I went. They were already there. Caitlin sat hunched in a chair near the reception desk, her hands clutching a small blanket. Her hair was tangled, eyes hollow. Aaron stood nearby, speaking to a nurse. He spotted me and gave a quick nod. I didn't ask anything. I just walked toward them and sat down. No one said much. After a few minutes, a nurse came and guided them through a set of doors. I stayed in the waiting area, staring at a spot on the floor where someone had once spilled coffee. The stain was faint, but permanent, like so many things in life. I folded my hands, let my fingers rest against each other, and waited. Minutes passed, like hours. The television in the corner played a muted infomercial. A young couple walked in and whispered to the receptionist. A janitor wheeled a mop bucket past me, the scent of ammonia trailing behind. None of it felt real. Eventually, Aaron returned. He said they were running tests. He didn't look at me when he spoke. I asked if he needed anything. He shook his head. Then he paused, as if deciding whether to say more. Finally, he said they were checking Owen for respiratory distress, that he had been wheezing and turning pale, that Caitlin thought it might be something serious. I wanted to say that newborns often had trouble adjusting to breathing in the world, that things like this were terrifying, but not always tragic. But I didn't say anything. I just nodded and sat back down. A doctor passed through the lobby, clipboard in hand. Another nurse called someone's name. The clock ticked. My chest felt like it was being gripped by something invisible. I rubbed my knees, one after the other, to keep them from stiffening. More time passed. Finally, Aaron came back again. His eyes were red. He said they needed to do a blood transfusion, that Owen had a rare condition, that it had to be quick, and they couldn't find a compatible match in the local registry. He looked at me then, for the first time, with something raw in his face. He didn't ask me. He didn't need to. I stood before he finished speaking. They took me into a small room. A nurse spoke to me about consent, about risk, about compatibility. I nodded through the words. I didn't need explanations. They ran a quick test. The results came back faster than I expected. A match. A perfect match. They cleaned my arm, tied a band around it, swabbed the skin, inserted the needle. I watched the blood leave me, dark, steady, purposeful. It filled a small bag hanging from a stand beside me. I didn't feel faint. I felt present, completely awake. As the blood flowed, I thought of nothing else. Not of how I had been pushed aside. Not of the distance, the cold rooms, the whispering behind doors. None of it mattered. Only this did. When it was over, they thanked me and told me to rest a bit. I sat there, arm bandaged, staring at the tube now coiled on the tray. My blood, separated from me, yet still me. Still capable. Still needed. Aaron came in a few minutes later. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me for a long time. Then he left again. I sat there alone until the nurse returned. She smiled faintly, told me the transfusion was underway. I asked how Owen was doing. She said it was early, but stable. She said he was strong. I closed my eyes and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. In the hallway outside, I heard another whisper. But this one wasn't about me. It was life itself, rustling past the thin veil of uncertainty, reminding me that some things still flowed forward, even when you thought they had turned away. I sat in the corner of the hallway, across from the pediatric intensive care unit, in a chair that was too narrow for comfort. The vinyl cracked beneath me when I shifted, and the air smelled like bleach and recycled air, like the night would never leave this place. I had one of those hospital water cups in my hand, the kind with a built-in straw and a lid that always felt sticky, and it sat untouched, growing warm in my grip. I had already given my blood. They had already taken what they needed. There was nothing else for me to do except wait and listen. The hallway was long and sterile, punctuated by closed doors and over-polished tile that reflected the buzzing ceiling lights above. A man with a clipboard walked past twice. A nurse wheeled a machine that beeped softly and rolled like thunder in the silence. A young mother with tired eyes sat at the far end, staring into her phone like it might explain the world. We were all there in quiet suspension, held by the invisible threads of people we loved on the other side of the wall. I had never heard Owen cry. Not properly. Not the full-bodied wail that people say you can recognize from a mile away, as if it's wired into your blood. I had only seen photos. I had only witnessed that one moment on the sidewalk, his smile like a spark before a storm. But now my blood was inside him, circulating, moving, becoming part of him in a way no invitation could ever grant. That thought sat heavily in my chest, like a stone. Not grief, not pride. Something in between. Something like proof. Time passed. Or maybe it didn't. There were no windows in the hallway. Nothing to measure the difference between hours and seconds. Only the feeling in my legs told me I had been there a long time. I stretched them carefully, wincing as the stiffness cracked through my knees. My body was reminding me of its age again. And yet, inside that child, something ancient from me was running through something entirely new. Then the door opened. The doctor stepped out. He was young, not much older than Aaron, with a short white coat and glasses that he kept pushing up the bridge of his nose. His expression was composed but tired, like he'd been delivering sentences all night. He looked at me first. I didn't stand. I didn't need to. He walked toward me without rush, as though this moment was his last quiet one before moving to the next emergency. He stopped in front of me. His hands were clasped together at his waist, and he spoke softly. There was something in the way he measured his words, not like someone offering comfort, but someone offering facts. He said the transfusion had gone well, that Owen had stabilized, that the match had been exact. Unusually exact, he said, almost immediate in its compatibility. He explained the condition, how rare it was, how early symptoms often went unnoticed, how lucky they were to have caught it in time. He said that without the right blood type, without the precise cellular markers, The body could reject the transfusion or fail to respond quickly enough. But in this case, it hadn't. The boy had accepted the blood like it had always belonged to him. I didn't say anything. My hands were pressed together on my lap. The cup was still in one of them, but I no longer felt it. He said more. He talked about next steps, observation periods, immune response. He used technical terms I didn't retain. They floated past me like clouds with names I'd never learned. What I heard instead was something he hadn't said directly, something underneath all of it. My blood had saved the child. My body, old and forgotten by most, had done something no one else could have done that night. He finished by thanking me, professionally, kindly. Then he turned and walked down the hallway to another room, to another family, to another moment where life hung in the balance. I sat there, the sound of his voice echoing, not the words, but the tone, the certainty. It was the kind of voice that ended doubt, not through persuasion, through clarity. And suddenly, I remembered the first time I had heard a voice like that. Years ago, when Marlene was in labor with Aaron, the doctor had been a woman, middle-aged, no nonsense. She had spoken to me directly in the delivery room, telling me that my wife was strong, that everything was progressing. I had believed her instantly, not because I understood the medicine, but because I recognized the weight of truth when spoken plainly. Tonight had that same ring. I stood slowly, walking over to the windowless door that led to Owen's room. I didn't go inside. I wasn't sure I was allowed to, but I could see through the narrow glass panel. The room was dimly lit. A nurse was adjusting a machine, and Caitlin sat in a chair, leaning over the crib. I could just barely see Owen, wrapped in layers of fabric, tiny limbs twitching now and then in the haze of sedation or recovery. Aaron was there too. He stood behind Caitlin, his hand on her shoulder. He looked worn out, like he hadn't slept in days, but there was something different about his face. Not just fear, not just fatigue, something softer, something that looked like realization. I stood there for a long time, not moving, not making myself known, just watching, just absorbing the image of a life that might continue because of a decision made in the middle of the night. A needle in the arm, a quiet yes, a moment of being needed. Eventually, I turned and walked back toward the waiting area. The hallway had emptied out. Even the janitor had gone. I sat back down in the chair, my legs trembling slightly now from fatigue. I placed the cup of water on the floor beside me and rested my head against the wall. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a shadow. I didn't feel like an afterthought. The doctor's voice kept ringing in my ears, not because of what he had said, but because, through it, I had heard something else. Something no one had told me in a long time. You mattered. Tonight, you mattered. They led me into a small examination room with beige walls and buzzing fluorescent lights, the kind that made everything feel more fragile than it really was. There were no windows, just a faint antiseptic smell lingering behind the sterile curtains and the hush of machinery breathing somewhere behind the walls. I was told to sit on a padded recliner that squeaked beneath me as I settled into it. A nurse pulled a metal tray closer, rolling it gently on rubber wheels. She smiled faintly, in that professional way medical workers do. Kind but distracted, efficient without warmth. She wrapped a blood pressure cuff around my arm and told me to relax. My other arm was propped on a small pillow. She began tapping gently against the crook of my elbow, searching for a vein that could carry the weight of something more than blood. My veins had always been good ones, thick, visible, strong. Years of labor, lifting, twisting, hammering, wiring. They had given me hands that remembered, arms that didn't complain. But lately, even they had begun to resist. The skin was thinner now, the vessels buried just a little deeper. Time does that. It pulls things inward. She tapped again, frowned, then switched to the other arm. Her fingers were soft, but I felt her hesitation. I had seen that expression before, years ago, when Marlene had been in chemo. The nurse's gentle squint, the tiny shift of weight from one foot to the other, the way her breath caught ever so slightly before she said, "Let's try this one." I nodded silently. She tied the rubber tourniquet around my bicep, tight and high, and asked me to make a fist. I did. The muscles responded slower than I remembered, and the skin stretched tight across my knuckles. She dabbed alcohol onto the skin, brisk and cold. Then she picked up the needle. It was larger than I expected, or maybe everything just looked bigger when you were vulnerable. She warned me that there might be a pinch, but I had been pinched by worse things in life. The needle slid in, just barely, and then paused. She adjusted the angle, watched for blood, tilted it slightly again. Nothing. She withdrew gently and pressed a cotton ball against the site. I saw no frustration in her face, just resignation. She had done this many times before. She apologized softly and moved to the next site, just below. Another dab of alcohol, another poke, another adjustment. This time, it worked. A dark thread of blood slipped into the tube, winding its way slowly toward the collection bag that hung beside me. I felt the pull, a soft pressure inside my arm, a draining sensation that didn't hurt but reminded me that something important was leaving me. I watched it flow, dark and steady, without bubbles or hesitation. The nurse adjusted the clamp and smiled again. She told me to squeeze the rubber ball in my palm every few seconds. I obeyed, counting the rhythm silently in my head. 1 squeeze, 2, pause, repeat. With each pulse, more of me left my body. And yet I didn't feel smaller. I felt anchored, like each drop was proof of presence, proof that my life, my blood, still held weight. The chair reclined a little, and a warm blanket was draped over my legs. I hadn't realized I was cold until I felt the warmth. I settled into it, letting the rhythm of the process become a kind of meditation. I thought about veins then, about how they carry everything without recognition, how they do their work in silence, never praised, rarely seen, but always needed. I thought about how many years my veins had carried burdens I didn't speak aloud. Financial stress, grief, disappointment, and lately, invisibility. I thought of how my heart had kept pumping, feeding them, sending out signals, even when the world around me had stopped looking. Now, that quiet river inside me had a destination. It was going into Owen, into his tiny new body that had no idea who I was, or what I had done, or what I had failed to do. It would carry oxygen to his cells, strength to his limbs. It would become part of him. Maybe in some microscopic way, he'd carry me forward, long after I was gone. The nurse checked on me periodically, nodding with approval at the flow rate. She asked if I was dizzy. I said no. She offered water, which I declined. I didn't want anything that might interrupt the stillness of this moment. My thoughts drifted again. I remembered the first time Aaron had fallen off his bike. He was 5, maybe 6. His knee was torn open, blood running down his shin, and he screamed like the world was ending. I had rushed to him, scooped him up, pressed a towel against the wound. He had cried against my chest, his breath hot and wet. I had carried him into the house, whispering that it would be okay, that blood was strong, that it always found a way to heal. He had believed me then. Now I was giving that same blood to his son, and no one had asked for a promise. No one had demanded a whisper of comfort, only action, only sacrifice, and that felt cleaner, more honest. The bag was half full when the nurse adjusted the needle again, checking the flow. I felt a slight sting, then numbness. She apologized again, more out of habit than necessity. I told her it was fine. She smiled and said, "You're doing great." I didn't answer. Words would have broken the spell. The room remained quiet, save for the soft rustle of her gloves, the occasional beep from a nearby monitor, the hum of ventilation. I looked at the ceiling tiles, counted them. I closed my eyes for a moment and listened to the sound of my own breath. When the bag was full, she clamped the line and gently withdrew the needle. I didn't flinch. She pressed another cotton ball to the wound, wrapped it tight with a strip of white tape. Then she labeled the bag, sealed it, and walked it out of the room. I sat there for a while, feeling both light and heavy. My arm ached faintly, and the skin where the needle had been felt warm. I didn't move. I didn't want to. The world outside the room could wait. Eventually, she returned and told me I could go, that they'd let me know how everything progressed, that I had done something important. I nodded, stood slowly, and reached for my coat. My hand trembled as I slipped it into the sleeve, not from weakness, but from the enormity of the moment. As I walked out into the hallway, the lights seemed less harsh. The floor beneath my feet felt more solid, and the air, though still sterile, carried the faint scent of meaning. It was a small room, a simple procedure, a quiet act, but in that space, my veins had finally spoken. And what they said was this: I was still part of something, still necessary, still alive. I waited alone in the corner of the dim recovery room, my coat draped over my lap like a shield I no longer needed. The transfusion was over, and they had already escorted me back from the small donor suite with polite words and a quiet sense of conclusion. But I didn't want to leave the hospital. Not yet. Something about the hallway's humming lights and low murmurs made me feel as though I had been folded into a moment bigger than myself, something I didn't want to break by stepping outside. They had given me a pass to sit quietly in the family waiting area. I didn't ask for it. A nurse simply touched my shoulder and said, "You can wait here if you like." I nodded. She brought me a cup of lukewarm coffee and left it on the table beside me. I didn't touch it. I was afraid that if I moved, even for that, I might miss something. From where I sat, I couldn't see the crib, but I could hear it. Through the open door to the neonatal room came the sound of machines, soft beeps, rhythmic puffs, and underneath it all, the faintest rise and fall of breath. Owen's breath, the kind that doesn't yet know how to hold itself steady, the kind that has just arrived in the world and is still learning what it means to stay. Each time the machine exhaled in sync with him, I listened closely, as though I could read his strength in the length of the silence between each inhale and exhale. His breathing was uneven, sometimes fast, sometimes shallow. Sometimes it stopped just long enough to make my chest tighten. Then it would return again, barely a whisper, as fragile as smoke in the cold. The world outside those glass doors had faded to irrelevance. Nothing mattered except those small gasps. I had never known how much could rest in something so light, so temporary. But every breath he took now felt like a conversation with existence, a negotiation, a fight. I imagined what it must feel like to be born with lungs that weren't quite ready, to be taken from a place of warmth and silence into a world of air and lights and foreign textures, to be held by nothing but tubes and the will of the body. I remembered holding Aaron once when he had bronchitis, how his chest rattled, and I could feel every laborious breath against my own ribs. That had frightened me then. But this was different. This wasn't fear. This was reverence. At some point, Aaron came into the room and sat in the chair across from me. His shoulders were slumped forward, eyes hollow with exhaustion. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. We sat like two old statues weathered by different kinds of storms. There was no need to fill the space with explanations. The breathing was doing all the speaking we needed. I watched Aaron steal glances through the glass. I could tell he was listening too. Caitlin had gone to lie down somewhere down the hall, and now the two of us were left with nothing but our thoughts and the steady sound of fragile life. I wondered if he understood what had happened. Not the science, not the procedure, but the weight of it. The unspoken transaction of giving what was once considered spent and watching it take root somewhere new. A nurse came in and adjusted something in the room beyond the glass. I watched her hands move, gentle, certain, quick. She touched Owen's chest with the tips of her fingers, pressing lightly, checking something. His foot twitched. Then she nodded and left. The sound of his breathing changed just a little, more consistent, less staggered. Aaron noticed it too. I saw it in the way his hands unclenched from the fists they had been holding in his lap. His shoulders shifted upward, just barely. He leaned back into the chair and let out a long, quiet breath of his own. It was the first I'd heard from him all night. I turned my head again toward the sound of Owen's breath. I closed my eyes. I counted each rise and fall like it was a prayer. I didn't know if he would remember this night. Most people don't remember their first days, their first hours. But something in me believed that maybe, somewhere in his body, the memory would remain, not in thought, but in rhythm. That maybe, years from now, when he took a deep breath before doing something brave, a part of that strength would come from this very moment. I thought about my own first breath. I didn't know where I was when I took it. I didn't know who held me or what kind of world I was born into. But I knew that it carried me this far, that every breath since had been a gift extended on credit. Now, part of that credit had been passed down. I remembered a story Marlene once told me about a song her mother used to hum when she was small. It didn't have words. It was just a melody. But every time she was afraid, every time her breath caught in her chest, that melody would calm her. I imagined humming it now, softly, quietly, to the rhythm of Owen's breath, not aloud, just in my head, a lullaby for borrowed lungs. Outside, the sky had begun to turn blue. The first light of morning crept across the linoleum floor and made shadows of the chairs. The nurse came in again, this time with a chart in hand. She looked at Aaron, then at me, and smiled. "Still stable," she said. She didn't need to say more. Aaron stood and walked to the window, resting his palm on the glass. He looked smaller in that moment, like the boy I used to carry when he scraped his knees. He whispered something I couldn't hear, but I saw the look in his eyes. It was gratitude. It was fear. It was relief too large for language. I stayed seated, listening. The breathing didn't falter. It held steady, soft and sure, filling the room with its quiet percussion. It was fragile, yes, but it was there. Morning arrived without ceremony. The hospital didn't acknowledge it the way the world outside did. There was no birdsong, no warmth spreading across kitchen tiles, no smell of coffee or toast. There was only the shift in light, the fluorescent bulbs now battling a soft gray dawn, pushing through the narrow windows near the ceiling. The hallway looked the same, but something in the air had changed. Lighter, somehow. Not joyful, not yet, but less heavy. The kind of lightness that follows a long storm and doesn't quite know what to do with itself. I was still sitting in the same chair. My body ached from it. My hip had stiffened, my lower back pulsed with a dull heat, and I had stretched my legs so many times I lost count. But I didn't leave. I didn't move unless someone needed to pass by. I drank half the coffee someone had left for me, and even though it was cold, it grounded me. Owen was still stable. That word, stable, had become something holy, not miraculous, just solid, just enough. I heard Aaron speaking in the hallway, Not to me, but to someone else. One of the nurses. His voice carried further than he intended. I could tell he was trying to be quiet, but stress had worn down his filter. There was a crack in his composure now, and through it, things began to escape. I didn't mean to listen. I tried not to, but the words came through clearly, as if they were looking for me, as if they had been waiting too long in silence. He said they hadn't known about the condition. He said they had been told there was a small chance, something in the family line, something distant, but it didn't seem real. It didn't seem relevant. He said he was grateful the donor was a match, but even more stunned by how quickly it had all worked. And then he said my name. He said it in a way I hadn't heard in years, not casually, not dismissively, not the way people speak of someone who lingers too long at the table. He said I saved his son, not the doctors, not the hospital, not science. Me. He didn't say it as a declaration. He said it like a realization, like something he had been holding just behind his teeth all night, and finally let fall out. The nurse said something in response. I couldn't hear her words, but his voice returned again, quieter now, like he had turned away. He said he hadn't been fair. He said I had always been present, even when they hadn't made space for me. He said he didn't know how to fix that. Then the voices faded. The footsteps moved down the hallway, toward the far doors. I stayed in my chair, motionless. I hadn't realized how long I had gone without hearing my name spoken like that. With weight. With meaning. It had become something functional in recent years, something used by receptionists and pharmacists and strangers on the phone. But hearing it from him, here now, it was like being pulled back into the world from some dim corridor of forgetting. For years, I had watched from doorways. I had stood on the edges of photographs, stayed quiet in family gatherings, accepted a quiet seat at every table. I had made peace with that. Or I thought I had. But in that moment, with those words still echoing in my chest, I felt something shift inside me. Not pride, not triumph, just the gentle cracking of something that had been sealed too long, the kind of crack that lets light in. Later, I stood and walked down the hallway, not toward Owen's room, not to press my face against the glass, but toward the window that faced the hospital courtyard. The sun had risen, though it hadn't broken through the clouds yet. Still, the light was different, not warm, but no longer cold. It touched the cement in a way that softened its edges. I stood there for a long time, hands in my coat pockets, listening to the distant sounds of movement, of conversations behind doors, of phones ringing and shoes squeaking against tile. But none of it mattered as much as the words I had already heard. They had moved through walls, walls of architecture, walls of silence, walls of distance, and they had landed. I remembered something Marlene once said to me after a particularly difficult visit with her father. She said, "Sometimes you don't need an apology. You just need to know they saw you standing there." At the time, I hadn't fully understood. Now I did. Aaron had seen me, not just in the room, not just as a presence to manage. He had seen what I had carried, what I had given. And even if nothing changed outwardly, even if life resumed its patterns tomorrow, those words had already rearranged something fundamental inside me. I leaned my forehead lightly against the cool window glass and closed my eyes. Behind me, someone walked past and gently patted my shoulder. It might have been a nurse. It might have been no one I knew. But it didn't matter. I had already heard what I needed to, words that had waited years to be said, and they had finally found their way. When they told us he would be all right, the words didn't hit like thunder. They came gently, almost shyly, as if they were afraid to shatter the fragile quiet we had all built around ourselves. A nurse stepped into the room and spoke softly, careful not to raise her voice above the hum of machines. Her eyes lingered on Aaron first, then drifted toward me, like she wasn't sure if I was part of the story, or just another visitor passing through someone else's emergency. She said Owen's breathing had normalized. His color was back. The transfusion had done exactly what it needed to do. Then she left, and the room exhaled. I didn't cheer. Neither did Aaron. There were no high fives or gasps of joy, just stillness, just the hush that follows chaos, the kind that doesn't celebrate. It observes. Aaron sat on the small vinyl bench beside the crib, his hands folded loosely between his knees. His head was bowed, not in prayer, but in exhaustion. There was a slope in his shoulders I hadn't seen before, a softness that replaced the rigid posture he usually carried. He looked like someone who had let go of something too heavy and now didn't know what to do with the empty space it left behind. I remained in the corner, one hand resting on the armrest of my chair, the other in my coat pocket. My legs were crossed, though I didn't remember crossing them. The chair creaked each time I shifted, so I tried not to move. Everything felt still, like the air had thickened slightly, like we were sitting in a room that had stopped spinning for just a moment. The storm had passed, but it had left behind a kind of silence that demanded something else entirely: patience. We didn't speak. There was no need. There's a language between men who've watched something helpless struggle to survive. You don't talk about it while it's happening, and you don't rush to define it afterward. You just sit in it. You carry it in your breath, in your spine, in the quiet recognition that you both witnessed something delicate refuse to break. Outside the window, the morning had begun to unfold slowly. Trees moved faintly in the breeze, casting long shadows on the hospital wall. The sky was an unsteady blue, streaked with soft gray clouds. Nothing dramatic, just enough to know the day was real. I thought about the night, about the drive to the hospital, about the sharp snap of cold air when I opened the door, about the moment the nurse looked up from the chart and told me my blood was a perfect match. That phrase, perfect match, had echoed through my head for hours now. It didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like a verdict finally overturned. In the quiet that followed, I kept thinking about how thin the line is between presence and absence. A child's breath, a heartbeat, a voice that says, "You matter." For so long, I had been orbiting around my family, showing up at holidays, offering help, stepping aside when things got too crowded. I had accepted that role, the quiet one, the steady figure in the corner. But that night, my blood had crossed the boundary. It had moved from observer to participant, from the edge of the room to the core of the crisis. And no one could erase that. At some point, Caitlin returned. Her eyes were swollen, but calm. She stood at the doorway for a long time before stepping inside. She didn't look at me right away. She moved to the crib, placed her hand gently on Owen's chest, and stared at him like she hadn't blinked in hours. She didn't cry. Her lips moved silently, and her shoulders rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths. I stayed seated. I didn't want to disturb her stillness. Aaron stood and wrapped his arm around her. Their bodies leaned into each other, not with romance, but with the weight of shared endurance. They had survived something together, and they knew it. I looked away, not out of discomfort, but respect. The machines beeped gently. A monitor ticked at regular intervals. The sound of air moving through the vents filled the room with a soft hum. In a way, the machines spoke more clearly than we could. They told us Owen was here, that he was breathing, that he was stable, that we had made it through. Eventually, Caitlin looked at me. Her eyes landed on mine for a moment too long to be accidental. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. She nodded once, slowly. It was the smallest thing, but it was everything. I nodded back, and that was it. The bridge wasn't rebuilt. The history wasn't rewritten. but a thread had been pulled taut between us. Thin, tentative, but real. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need a speech. That nod was a kind of truce, a quiet acknowledgement that, when it mattered most, I had been more than just the man sitting by the window. After a while, I stepped out into the hallway to stretch my legs. The floor was cool underfoot. The corridor was nearly empty now, just a few stray nurses charting at stations, a janitor pushing a mop bucket with slow precision. The world was waking up, and I was inside it. Not beside it. Inside it. I walked to the vending machine near the far wall and stood in front of it without hunger. Rows of brightly packaged snacks blinked behind glass. I didn't want any of it. I just stood there, letting the hum of the machine fill the space between my thoughts. I thought about going home, about my quiet kitchen, about the cradle still tucked away in the back closet, covered in the quilt Marlene had sewn all those years ago. For the first time, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, it didn't have to stay hidden. Maybe that silence in the house wasn't permanent. Maybe it had only been waiting for the right kind of noise. Owen's breath had returned to its rhythm, and so had mine. I returned home the next morning with my coat still smelling faintly of antiseptic and machine-warmed air. I didn't notice it at first. It was only when I hung it by the door and walked into the kitchen that I realized the smell had followed me. Hospitals leave their fingerprints on you like that. Cold, quiet, invisible, until you step back into the warmth of your own walls. The house was just as I had left it. Still, familiar. My cup from the night before still sat on the table with a ring of dried tea inside. A sliver of morning light stretched across the floor, highlighting every groove in the wooden planks. I stood in that light for a long time, letting the silence come back around me like a blanket that had never stopped waiting. But something had changed. Not the furniture, not the air. Me. There's a kind of silence that follows a storm, a silence that doesn't mourn, doesn't question. It just holds. It holds the after, the weight of having been needed, the strange ache of knowing you can't be put back in the same drawer as before. I felt that ache now, not like pain, more like clarity. I walked into the living room and sat in my usual chair. The cradle was still in the closet, but I could feel its presence behind the wall. For the first time, I didn't think of it as a symbol of something lost. It had become something else. A placeholder, perhaps. A reminder that some things wait for their purpose longer than others. The house creaked softly as the temperature adjusted. I listened to the radiator pipes begin their slow knocking rhythm, like bones remembering how to move. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes. I didn't need sleep. I needed stillness. And now I had it. At some point, I heard the soft thump of mail landing in the box. I stood and walked slowly to the front door, pausing for a moment before opening it. The morning air hit me like a question, cool, quiet, full of possibility. I took the envelopes and sifted through them with the kind of patience that only comes from having nowhere to be. Bills, advertisements, one postcard from the hardware store, then, tucked between them, a plain white envelope with no return address. I brought it inside, sat back down, and opened it carefully. Inside was a photograph, a simple one, not staged, not edited, just a moment. It was Owen, swaddled in a light blue blanket, his tiny fist resting against his cheek, his mouth half open in sleep. No tubes, no wires, just breath, life. A child at rest in a world he had barely begun to understand. There was no note, no signature. But I knew who had sent it. I placed the photo on the table and sat back again. The room seemed fuller now, as if the photograph had changed the air itself. I looked around, not to find anything, but to see the familiar with new eyes. And that's when I realized what this was. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation. It was recognition. Quiet, deliberate recognition. And for a man like me, who had spent so long existing in the corners of rooms, whose name had so often gone unspoken, that recognition was everything. I didn't need applause. I didn't need fanfare. I didn't need to be paraded through the hospital halls as a hero. I just needed to know that the thing I had always feared most, that I would be forgotten while still alive, had been held at bay for one more season. I thought about all the things I could say now, to Erin, to Caitlin, even to Owen, though he wouldn't understand. I thought about writing something down, but I didn't move. Words had already done their part, and now silence had its turn. Outside, the leaves on the maple tree shifted gently in the breeze. A single bird landed on the railing and pecked at something unseen before fluttering away again. The world was unchanged, and yet I had never felt so firmly placed inside it. I stood up and went to the closet. I pulled out the cradle, dusted it off, and carried it to the center of the living room. I didn't know if it would ever be used, but I wanted it in the open now. I wanted it visible, not for show, for truth. I unfolded the quilt Marlene had sewn, the one with the stitched moons and stars, and draped it across the cradle with the same care I had once used for Erin's baby blankets. Then I sat back down and simply looked at it. There are victories that come with headlines and speeches, victories that demand attention and celebration. But there are other victories, quieter ones, that settle deep into your bones and stay there. Victories where no one claps, no one sings, and yet something inside you begins to heal. This was that kind. No trumpets, no banners, just breath, just silence, just a photograph on the table, and the knowledge that I had not been erased,